In the history of world football, the pantheon of goalkeeping greatness is often reserved for those who captured the imagination during World Cups or hoisted European Cups under the bright lights of continental giants. Names like Yashin, Banks, and Dino Zoff are etched into the collective consciousness of the sport. Yet, there exists a figure whose statistical dominance and sheer technical brilliance during the 1980s suggest he belongs not just in the conversation, but perhaps at the very top of the list. Neville Southall, the man who guarded the net for Everton and Wales, remains one of the most enigmatic and underappreciated titans of the game. To understand why a man who was arguably the best goalkeeper in the world for a 3 to 5 year period is now rarely mentioned in global greatest of all-time lists, one must look at the unique intersection of era, geography, and a fiercely individualistic personality that defied the burgeoning era of the media-trained athlete. The primary hurdle to Southall's global legacy is the historical vacuum created by the Heysel Stadium disaster. In 1985, Southall was the undisputed premier goalkeeper in England, having just led Everton to a league title and the European Cup Winners' Cup. He was named the FWA Footballer of the Year, an incredibly rare feat for a goalkeeper. At that moment, Everton was widely considered one of the two best teams in Europe alongside Juventus. Had English clubs not been banned from European competition for 5 years following the events in Belgium, Southall would have had the platform to showcase his talents in the European Cup. Without that stage, his prime years were spent in a domestic isolation that limited his exposure to international audiences. While his contemporaries like Jean-Marie Pfaff or Reinhard Desailly were gaining continental fame, Southall was a localized phenomenon, a giant performing miracles in a league that the rest of the world could only read about in newspapers rather than watch on global broadcasts. Furthermore, Southall's international career was spent representing Wales, a nation that struggled to qualify for major tournaments during his tenure. The World Cup factor is the ultimate currency for goalkeeping legends. Banks has 1966, Zoff has 1982, and Iker Casillas has 2010. Southall, despite his individual heroics, never appeared on the greatest stage of all. There are no montages of him making a save of the century in a World Cup quarter-final because the opportunity simply never existed. For the casual historian, a player who never played in a World Cup or a European Cup final often becomes a footnote, regardless of how high their peak performance actually was. His excellence was a weekly occurrence at Goodison Park, witnessed by 40,000 people at a time, but it lacked the televised global mythology required to cement a legacy in the digital age. From a technical standpoint, Southall was a pioneer who refined goalkeeping into a precise science. He was obsessed with the mechanics of the position. Long before the era of dedicated goalkeeping coaches and data analytics, Southall was studying his own movements with a forensic intensity. He was known for his incredible agility and soft hands, a term used to describe his ability to not just block shots, but to catch them and deaden the ball's momentum instantly. His positioning was so advanced that he often made world-class saves look routine, which paradoxically might have hurt his highlight reel longevity. He didn't rely on the camera save or unnecessary theatrics. He was a master of angles. If a striker felt they had a clear sight of goal, they would look up to find Southall already there, having narrowed the gap with a subtle, proactive movement that few others could replicate. However, the image of Neville Southall in his later years has also contributed to the erosion of his status. As his career progressed into the mid-90s, Southall's physique changed. He became a heavier, more weathered figure, far removed from the lean, mustachioed athlete of the mid-80s. In a sport that increasingly prioritizes aesthetic athleticism and branding, the sight of a veteran Southall, his jersey often untucked and his frame appearing more like a Sunday League stalwart than a professional icon, created a disconnect. This visual decline has, in many ways, overridden the memory of his peak. Modern viewers seeing clips of a 37-year-old Southall often fail to realize they are looking at a man who, a decade earlier, possessed reflexes that were borderline supernatural. The cultural shift in football also played a role. Southall was a man of the people, famously known for his bluntness and lack of interest in the trappings of fame. One of the most famous images of him is the halftime protest in 1990, where he sat against a goalpost on the pitch while his teammates were in the dressing room. While Everton fans understood this as a sign of his immense frustration with declining standards, the national media framed it as the act of a disgruntled eccentric. Southall never played the media game. He didn't seek out endorsements or cultivate a brand. He was a former binman who treated goalkeeping with the same blue-collar work ethic he applied to everything else. In an era where players were becoming global celebrities, Southall remained a grit and grime professional. This lack of a polished public persona meant that when he retired, there was no marketing machine to keep his name in the public eye. There is also the matter of the greatest lists themselves, which often suffer from a heavy bias toward the modern era or the golden age of the 1960s and 70s. The 1980s are often seen as a transitional period in football history, caught between the total football of the 70s and the commercial explosion of the Premier League in 1992. Southall's best years are trapped in this middle ground. By the time the Premier League became a global juggernaut, Southall was in the twilight of his career. Younger fans remember Peter Schmeichel as the definitive goalkeeper of the 90s, often forgetting that Schmeichel himself cited Southall as a major influence and one of the toughest opponents he ever faced. The Danish keeper's star jump style was iconic, but Southall's efficiency was arguably superior during his 1984 to 1987 peak. To talk about Southall's greatness is to talk about a man who recorded 269 clean sheets for Everton. It is to talk about his performance against Tottenham in the opening game of the 1985 season, or his miraculous save against Mark Falco that defied the laws of physics. It is to acknowledge a player who was so dominant that his teammates often felt they were playing with a psychological head start. They knew that even if the defense breached, the man behind them was nearly impossible to beat. Yet, because he stayed loyal to Everton during their decline rather than seeking a move to a European powerhouse like Real Madrid or Bayern Munich, his trophy cabinet doesn't match the sheer scale of his talent. In the documentary of Football's Lost Legends, Southall occupies a unique space. He was a master of a craft that he treated with the solemnity of a monk and the intensity of a prize fighter. He was the last of a breed, the local hero who reached the summit of the world without ever leaving his roots. The reason he is rarely mentioned among the greatest isn't a reflection of his ability, but a reflection of how we measure greatness. We measure it in trophies, in World Cup goals, and in high-definition replays. Southall's greatness was written in the mud of winter afternoons, in the quiet frustration of strikers who did everything right only to find a pair of hands waiting for the ball, and in a consistency that modern goalkeepers can only dream of. His absence from the conversation is a failure of historical memory rather than a failure of his own performance. If one were to build a goalkeeper from the ground up combining the bravery of a shot stopper, the intelligence of a tactician, and the durability of a marathon runner, the result would look remarkably like Neville Southall. To omit him from the top tier of history is to ignore one of the most statistically and technically proficient eras of goalkeeping ever seen. He was the silent guardian of a golden age for Everton, a man who didn't need the world to watch him to be the best in it. As the game continues to evolve into a spectacle of speed and light, the story of the binman who became a king remains a vital reminder that true greatness doesn't always need a global stage. Sometimes it just needs a goal frame and a relentless will to keep the ball out of it. Ultimately, Southall's legacy is preserved by those who saw him play. To the Everton faithful and those who faced him in the First Division, there is no debate. They saw the saves that weren't supposed to be possible. They saw a man who would finish a match and immediately go home to watch the tape to see where he could improve by a fraction of an inch. His lack of mention in modern debates is perhaps the ultimate irony. He was so good at making the impossible look easy that history eventually took his brilliance for granted. We remember the flamboyant, the loud, and the marketed. Southall was none of those things. He was simply the best at what he did, at a time when the world wasn't quite looking, and in a jersey that he wore with more pride than any trophy could ever provide. As we look back at the archives of the 20th century, it is time to restore the man from Llandudno to his rightful place, not as a cult hero or a regional legend, but as one of the few truly perfect exponents of goalkeeping the world has ever produced.